Welcome back, everyone, and I hope you had a good break. I'm delighted now to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Eva PenzeyMoog. Eva is a principal designer at Eighth Light, and she's also the author of the book Design for Safety. And Eva uses her expertise in advocating for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault to help technologists mitigate the harm that we often inadvertently enable through technology. And she does that by focusing on the safety and the privacy of our most vulnerable users. Now, Eva isn't able to present live for us today since she's actually on recent parental leave, but I'm delighted that she's recorded a talk just for us. If you have comments during the talk, then please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll gladly pass them on to Eva. I hope you'll agree that it's a talk that really highlights the pressing human case for privacy in everything that we do, and I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Eva.
Thanks so much for having me today at this event. I'm really excited to be here, the Information Commissioner's Office. The name of my talk is Designing for Safety Key Considerations. My name is Eva PenzeyMoog. I am the author of a book called Design for Safety, which is available through A Book Apart. I'm the founder of the Inclusive Safety Project. You can learn more at inclusivesafety.com. I'm a principal designer at a software consultancy called Eighth Light, which is in the US and the UK, and my pronouns are she and her. And quick shout out to Kenneth for getting me here today. Really excited to be part of this event. This is recorded, and I am 99% sure that I will actually be here for the event to do a Q&A after the talk is over. So if you have any questions, definitely throw them in the chat or just write them down and we will get to them at the end. Quick trigger warning, some of the sensitive things that I'm going to be talking about today include domestic violence, child abuse. There'll also be sort of very passing references to sexual assault, more in a way to talk about consent. The great thing about doing these presentations totally online, assuming that most of you are online as well, is that it's super easy to step away if you need to. If you are in person somewhere, definitely still step away if you feel overwhelmed at any time. And just need a break, please do take care of yourself in that moment. Our agenda today includes a quick overview of what I mean when I say designing for safety. We'll spend the bulk of our time talking about the key considerations, which are sort of 4 different things that I've identified as the main issues when it comes to interpersonal harm in tech. I'm going to talk a bit about integrating designing for safety into your work, and then we will have the Q&A. And I know that this group is especially focused on information technology and privacy. I do a lot of work with different companies internally with designers and program people and project people. So I've tried to make sure that this presentation is going to be sort of like broad and apply to different people in the room. I also think that this group probably has a little bit more of a background than the people I usually work with. So I hope that this is still very useful for you. There should still be some new things, and we can get started. All right, so I'm going to quickly define what designing for safety means for me, because I know that safety can mean a whole lot of different things in a whole lot of different contexts, as I'm sure this group knows. Designing for safety, when I'm talking about it, means doing realistic assessments of how a product facilitates interpersonal harm and then preventing and mitigating that harm. So the focus here is really on interpersonal harm that happens within interpersonal relationships between people who actually know each other and have some type of relationship. So something like anonymous harassment on Twitter would not be part of this. Domestic violence is the really common one, but there's also issues of child abuse, elder abuse, as well as just abuse between things like friends or roommates. Also employees and employers is becoming a really big sort of group within this space where technology facilitated interpersonal harm is happening. But this is basically anyone that you have a relationship with, and there is the potential for some type of tech abuse. Designing for safety also means prioritizing the goals of vulnerable users while working against the goals of users who seek to use the product for harm. This is a little bit different from how designers and especially UX designers typically think about goals. Definitely different from the way that I was taught to think about this stuff, where it's more like, what are the most important goals that our users want to achieve? Let's help them achieve them. Designing for safety means that, yes, we do that for our survivors or our victims who are using the product, but we also work to identify the abuser's goals and then see if there's a way that we can prevent them from achieving those goals, or much more likely, do something to mitigate the harm that will come when they achieve those goals. And I'm going to talk more about mitigation, but this is a really important factor, is that lots of times in my experience, the harm is coming from a really core feature. So for example, I don't think it's realistic to say, some people stalk each other using Google Maps. So maybe Google Maps just shouldn't have the location sharing feature. I don't think that's a very realistic goal. I think what's more realistic is saying this is going to happen. So we need to find ways to mitigate the harm by giving the victim information about what is going on and then giving them options about what they do about it. Before we get into the key considerations of designing for safety, I want to quickly talk about checkbox frameworks and action bias. Checkbox frameworks are basically what they sound like. It's a list of items to consider that then you can check off. So you can say like, okay, I've considered history, I've considered bias, I've considered racism and sexism and interpersonal harm, check, check, check. And those are great in some contexts, but with things that have a lot more sort of background and history going on, they can be problematic, because when we use these in this way, we run the risk of prioritizing action at the expense of deep learning and internalizing the problem. It doesn't take unique factors about the problem into consideration. I've been asked to make checkbox frameworks for considering interpersonal harm with tech, and I've always pushed back because it's just such an oversimplification. The work that you all are doing at the ICO is going to be really different from what product designers at Google are doing. And there's just no way that a checkbox framework could actually kind of be comprehensive enough to include all of these different things. But they would make us feel overly secure that we've done all of the different things. It would give us a very false sense of security. Checkbox frameworks are ultimately closely connected to something called action bias, which is a tendency to favor action over inaction. It's responding with action as the default, even when we don't really have a solid rationale to support that action. Action bias happens when we are incapable with living with discomfort when presented with difficult topics. Action bias causes us to jump towards solutioning before we have fully understood and internalized the problems. And I just want to make a note that I definitely have action bias a lot. This is a really common thing. It's just such a normal and human response, and ultimately empathetic response to learning about a new problem. You get really fired up. You're like, wow, that's really bad. That's not okay. I really want to take action on it. And sometimes that's totally fine. But with these sort of bigger, more complicated topics, it's really important that we understand that there's a lot that we don't understand yet. Action bias can cause us to stop learning when we only have a very shallow understanding of a complex issue. It doesn't give space for us to understand generational, societal, and systems level factors. So I basically just wanted to bring this up because I want people to be aware of these things, and just to urge you to resist both checkbox frameworks and action bias, at least in this topic, and I'm sure in other topics as well that are very big and complex. And I bring this up because the talk that I'm going to give, it's 50 minutes, which is very short ultimately, and it might feel a little bit like I'm presenting a sort of checkbox framework and urging people to have action bias. But I definitely am not saying that you need to become an expert before you're able to take any action on this. I think that's actually its own problem. We really just need to be doing both. We need to spend time learning about something while also beginning to take action on it while deepening the learning. So I just hope that this is going to be considered more of a starting line for that learning when it comes to issues of interpersonal harm, as opposed to the finish line. All right. Now that I've said all the things and done all that groundwork setting, we can move into the actual key considerations of designing for safety. All of the things that I'm going to share today are stories of real people. They are composites that I've kind of stitched together from articles, studies, as well as people that I've interviewed myself. I've interviewed a lot of different survivors about their experiences. And they've all been sort of, details have been sort of put together and things have been changed slightly so that I can maintain people's privacy and keep it all anonymous, but these are all true stories. So the first story I'm going to share is about harm facilitated through Internet of Things or IoT devices. Rob is a college senior who lives with 3 roommates in a house near campus. Nathan is his roommate, and he's super into smart home devices. He has a bunch of different Internet of Things IoT devices. He has smart lights, a smart lock, a Nest thermostat, and he gets it all set up when they move in together. Nathan starts to mess with his roommates using the smart home devices, but after an argument with Rob about dirty dishes, he starts to really mess with Rob more and more. One night when Rob is trying to cook in the kitchen, Nathan turns out the lights from the other room using his app, and he does this over and over again. Rob tells him that it's not funny anymore, but he keeps doing it. Later on, Rob and Nathan disagree about the temperature. Rob is sweltering, but Nathan thinks it's comfortable and doesn't want to get cold and have to put on a sweater. The two use the Nest app to continuously change the temperature over and over again over the course of a few hours until Nathan just removes Rob from the app. He then starts to turn up the heat to 90 degrees as a joke, which, sorry, I didn't convert that to Celsius. I think it's like 40 something, makes it really hot, causes Rob to have to come down from his room and change the temperature on the actual Nest interface, which he can still do using the actual device that's on the wall, but it's really annoying that he can't use the app anymore. He finally gets fed up and decides he's just going to leave and go study in the campus library. When he returns, the key code for the smart lock on the front door doesn't work. He puts it in over and over again, but it just will not unlock. After pounding the door in frustration, Nathan opens it for him and insists that he is just not using this device properly. The next time Rob comes home, the code works again. Nathan thinks that Rob changed the code and then changed it back in order to mess with him, but there's no way that he can prove it. He feels like all of this joking around is morphing into bullying or just straight up harassment, but he has no idea what he can do about it. So let's talk about some considerations for dealing with IoT facilitated harm, or just things we need to keep in mind when it comes to this type of harm and privacy invasion. We need to remember that IoT devices can enable secret surveillance, invasion of privacy, gaslighting, and tormenting. So some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about or working with this type of harm are, is the survivor able to quickly identify what's happening and how it's happening? In this story, Rob knew what was going on with the lights and with the thermostat, but not with the lock. There wasn't any clear indication that the code had been changed since the last time he used it. And to me, this is a big problem. People should be able to very quickly grasp what is going on. Next up, is a survivor able to regain control of the device? This is going in a little bit of a different direction that we just heard, but very oftentimes with IoT abuse, the issue is that someone who has left the home still has access to the devices, and they are taking control of it in order to harass, monitor, invade the privacy, whatever, of the person who is still in the home. So for example, when I was researching for my book, I came across the story of this woman in Canada whose abusive boyfriend was away, and he would do things like turn off the heat in the middle of the night during a really cold winter night in Canada. For some people, the ability to understand who is in the account and how to remove them and take control of the device is really paramount, but these things are often actually not that easy to do. Lastly, is there a fallback for people who are intentionally excluded in the way that we saw with Rob and Nathan? In this story, Rob was still able to control the lights by using just the regular light switch and control the Nest, because even once he didn't have access to the app, he could still use the actual physical device that was mounted to the wall. But with the lock, there was no fallback. He was just locked out. Devices should always have some type of fallback, and not just for issues of abuse like this, but just because there are so many different examples of IoT devices malfunctioning, and then people just not being able to actually do something really basic that they need to be able to do, like get into their home. If anyone follows the Twitter account Internet of Shit, they do a great job of highlighting these types of issues with IoT devices malfunctioning or something going wrong. There's stories of like, the internet is out and now I can't turn on my lights, or the software is updating and I'm not able to open my doors. Okay, this next story is focused on control via shared accounts. Helen and Isaac are a recently married couple who have opened up a shared bank account. The only problem is, while their account is totally shared, including separate logins, Isaac is made the primary person on the account, meaning that it's his information that gets used on the verification quiz that shows up when certain issues arise, flagging any sort of minor potential security issue. And these are triggered by things as small as logging in from a new device or a new Wi-Fi network. This means that whenever Helen logs in from a new account or from a new computer or Wi-Fi network, or something else happens that triggers the verification quiz, the questions are all about Isaac and his identity. So for example, things like which house number goes with which old address, which of these streets have you lived on? Those questions are all about Isaac, and she has to often ask him for the answers because these questions are actually pretty good. Even people who have been together for a long time usually aren't going to be able to remember all of these details about the other person. So she has to ask him for the answers, which gives him a lot more power. Eventually, Isaac uses that power to cut Helen off from their shared account. He withdraws cash for her to use, essentially giving her an allowance. This type of financial abuse is extremely common in domestic violence contexts. Studies have found in multiple different countries that 99% of abusers will enact some form of financial control or abuse. And too often, digital financial products are tacitly enabling this abuse. So when it comes to considerations for control with shared accounts, we need to remember that they can enable taking control as well as surveillance and stalking. And those two other things are often a factor because of how much information about a person an abuser can get by surveilling the activity in an account, as well as the fact that there's often some type of location component. So these can become really big privacy issues as well. So for example, a banking software might show someone's home address. It might include the address of the main branch that they go to. So some things to consider are, does one user actually have more power? Ideally, the software would be built so that all users have the same amount of power. However, that is often not possible. And in that case, we need to ask ourselves, is this power imbalance transparent or opaque? A lot of times it is just legitimately not possible to not have some type of primary user or admin level user. With banking, I've talked to people who have shared that, who work in this space, who have shared that there's often just really huge database implications. You know, it's like something that got set up in the 80s or 90s when it was first all getting digitized. It would take literal years of like a huge team of developers to change this. And it's just not going to happen. When that's the reality, we just need to be transparent about it. And this is a really good example of where we aren't going to be able to prevent this from happening, but we can do a ton to mitigate the harm that can come from it. So bankers are either setting someone as the primary user, or maybe the software is just assigning it to the first person who gets added into a joint account. But it's completely opaque to the user that this is happening. If it wasn't opaque, if it was transparent, the potential for abuse and privacy invasion would still be there. But in this case, the survivor would be able to be prepared to make informed decisions that will keep them safe. We should always be trying to prevent the harm first, but when that's just not possible, we can at least mitigate it. And in this case, mitigation would mean making it very clear to the users that one of them is going to have more power than the other. This is actually something I'm dealing with right now, not in an abusive context, but I just bought a new car with my husband. And because he got to the dealership first, I had to wait until my workday was over, where he has more flexibility. So he went and got the process started. The person at the dealership got him going with the app, created his account, and now he's just the admin level user. And this isn't something that was ever talked about with us. No one like explained what the implications of this are. So now I'm doing a fun experiment where we're going to see like all the different ways that he is able to take control over my account, and we're doing experiments on like how can we stalk each other. And this is just like I'm living this example now of like, he is the admin user, I have less privileges, and this is never something that was spelled out ever in any way. And it's actually been like a struggle to figure out, what does this even mean for me? Next Is it clear when another user has access and performed tasks with the account? Ideally, this is very upfront and there's a clear record of who did what, such as a new user on the account or one user taking action like moving money from one account to another. Most of us are used to seeing emails about things like there's been a new user added to this account or this account was accessed from a new device. Those are really important, but they're not used as often as I think they could be, especially with accounts that have to do with really, really important topics that have to do with safety and privacy, such as money. It needs to be very clear who did what and who has access. The flip side of this, of course, is, sorry, let me go back. The flip side of this is, when does it become a privacy issue? When is it just another way for someone to use all this information that's being shared in order to monitor the activity of another? This is something that always comes up when I say that a solution is to provide like additional information about what's going on with a shared account. I think the answer to this, again, is to make it very transparent who can see what and just what exactly is going on to both parties. If the other user on the account is going to be able to see everything that I do, I need to know that so that if I'm in a dangerous situation, I can take certain actions to keep myself safe. And then finally, does the user with less power have a clear path forward to regaining control of their account? In the case of Isaac and Helen, there should be a very, very clear path forward for Helen to regain access to her money, such as being able to call someone up in a customer service center. This comes up a lot because I think a lot of companies rely too heavily on FAQ pages and chatbots, and those only go so far when it comes to the realities of the complexities of human interaction. Sometimes we just need to talk to an actual human being who can understand the nuances of our situation. Whenever there's a product with a shared account, there needs to be a recognition of these power imbalances and issues of control as being a thing that will need to be dealt with. And there needs to be a real human who can assist users in regaining control and navigating these issues. And I'm emphasizing this because a lot of products either just straight up don't have a legitimate customer service department, or they're so understaffed that it can take weeks to get back to just an email from a user. I mean, for example, Tesla is a giant company that kind of famously, has gone back and forth on if they even have any type of customer service. This isn't just an issue of user experience, but it can also be a serious safety issue. This next story is focused on interpersonal harms and privacy issues of surveillance. And I just want to say surveillance, obviously, this is a really huge topic that I'm going to only spend a few minutes talking about. So just throwing that caveat out there, this is a whole day-long talk or workshop on this topic that I'm just only going to kind of brush the surface of. So this is Owen. He's a 13-year-old boy. His parents are extremely concerned about his safety. And like many parents who are looking out for their kids in a time when it can be kind of scary, especially considering all the bad things that are online, they choose to surveil him in a few different ways. They also happen to be part of a very conservative church, and they want to make sure that their son isn't looking at anything online that they disapprove of, which includes a lot of things that are not blocked by traditional child-safe filters. There are cameras all around Owen's home that his parents use to watch his daily activities, especially for things like making sure that he's actually home and doing his homework on nights when they're both stuck at work. His parents have also installed what's known as stalkerware on his phone, which is software that allows them to secretly monitor all of his activity as well as things like the phone's location. So with stalkerware, there's nothing in the user interface that lets the person who is being monitored know that the software is installed. There's not even an app icon. You basically have to be a digital forensics expert or just have special security skills to identify that it's there. And I want to recognize that a lot of parents have something on their children's phone that is the sort of somewhat more consensual version of this, like the child knows it's there, and they could theoretically delete it, but the parent would know. But this is something that plenty of families are doing just much more out in the open, which is obviously a lot safer. It's always going to be better to like have conversations with your kid about, the need to keep them safe and to understand what's going on. I'm not talking, those can be invasive. And again, I'm just touching the surface here. Those can absolutely be invasive and invade privacy and become like an issue in terms of harm. But what I'm talking about is the really bad version of this, where stalkerware, where they have no idea that it's there. So Owen has this stalkerware installed on his phone. He doesn't know it's there. This is really problematic for him because he's recently been looking up articles about sexual identity. For a while now, Owen has been very privately coming to terms with the fact that he's gay. He lives in a very conservative community, and the church he goes to with his family explicitly condones this as a sin. He thinks he's probably never going to come out to his parents, or if he ever does, it'll at least be when he's away at university and not living with them anymore. But Owen doesn't know that his parents are able to see everything that he does on his phone. When his parents confront him about his online activity, Owen is devastated. He wasn't anywhere near ready to come out to his own friends, much less his parents, and suddenly the entire town knows that he's gay. His parents say that they cannot accept a son like him and tell him he needs to leave the house that night. This story is unfortunately a big reality, and homelessness among LGBTQ plus youth is a big concern, definitely both in the US, but also in the UK. According to a study by the Albert Kennedy Trust, LGBTQ plus youth experience homelessness at a very disproportionate rate. They found that nearly a quarter of homeless people are LGBTQ plus, and that 77% of them are made homeless by family rejection, abuse, or just being asked or told to leave the home. So in this story with Owen, which represents a lot of people in this situation, according to these statistics, the stalkerware technology that his parents put on his phone in an effort to keep him safe has actually now put him in a very dangerous situation. So when we're thinking about safety issues and issues of privacy with any product that has surveillance features, we need to recognize that they can very easily become invasive and weaponized for harm. The topic of surveillance is ultimately such a huge topic with so many other things going on. And the issue of surveillance and over surveillance of children is a really big thorny issue. But I do think that it's really important that anyone who is the target of surveillance, except under like maybe very, very special circumstances that are very, very rare, they need to know that they're being surveilled. I'm definitely not going to argue that kids shouldn't be surveilled by their parents, because there are lots of things parents should be aware of. And I don't think that's a realistic goal. But I do think we can work to ensure that the target of surveillance always knows that they're being surveilled, so that they can take actions to keep themselves safe. And right now in most countries, stalkerware is very much legal. And we do need legal solutions to this. But we can also, as technologists and people in this space, say that we won't ever work on something where everything is completely invisible to the person who is being targeted by surveillance. Relatedly, are there safeguards in place to make sure surveillance is not used against non-consenting adults? This goes back to stalkerware. These products always say that they're meant for keeping kids safe, but they offer nothing to ensure that it's not used against non-consenting adults. And the reality is they don't want to do that because this is a key part of their business model. But we have to make sure that people know that they're being surveilled. And I want to just really quickly give one other example, because surveillance can be a lot more sneaky. It's not always just like cameras in the home and monitoring software and stalkerware. The Amazon Echo drop-in feature is a really good example of how people sneakily surveil each other and invade people's privacy. So for those who aren't familiar, the drop-in feature is where you set up certain contacts from your phone to drop in on you, which means that the audio or video call, depending on the model of the Echo that you have, it just starts automatically. So unlike when you get a call on your phone where you see the number, the contact name, you can choose to accept or decline the call. This basically just makes an announcement and it connects the call right away. So if the volume is low, or if you're just not in the room when the little announcement is made, it basically becomes a listening device where the person dropping in can just not say anything and they can listen to the person they've dropped in on. And even though, Amazon kind of argues that it's safe because you have to be the one to set up who is allowed to drop in on you, but this is totally ignoring the domestic violence context where people may not actually have that level of control over their devices. And there are situations that have been documented where there are abusers doing things like listening in on their victims' phone calls with supportive family members, even their therapy sessions. So it's not just about cameras and monitoring software. There are these other really, really sneaky ways that people surveil each other. And then a final thing to consider, which I'm getting really into, is the surveillance even useful, or is it just a way to keep tabs on groups with less power, such as workers? Invasive and unethical surveillance and invasion of privacy of low-wage workers, and honestly, I think just lots of different types of workers in general, is becoming a really big issue. This is such an emerging thing in this space. So, for example, Amazon drivers use cameras in their drivers' trucks that involve artificial intelligence that give the driver points for being safe and dock points for being unsafe. And this is tied to things like their bonuses and also just ability to stay employed. It's meant to increase safety because, at least here in the US, there are lots of different examples of Amazon drivers being under so much pressure to deliver really quickly that they drive very dangerously and have had some really serious accidents in their cars that have actually killed people. So this is meant to increase safety, although arguably it's not actually causing or fixing the root of the issue. But the AI is really, really bad. It penalizes drivers for doing things like looking away from the road when they have to check their blind spots. It also docks points from their overall score if, say, someone cuts them off and they have to slam on their brakes. It removes agency from workers who already face a lot of different workplace issues, and it's not even useful. It doesn't actually increase safety, and it's motivating drivers to be less safe in many situations. I think in the world of increased AI, as well as remote working, a lot of employers are turning to this type of invasive surveillance in an attempt to continue to control their workers. And this amounts to really serious issues of privacy invasion and is honestly just becoming a human rights issue. Okay, this next story is about data location harms. Erica has been dealing with controlling behavior from her boyfriend, Dan, for pretty much the whole time they've been together. And recognizing that it's just getting worse and worse, she breaks up with him. But suddenly, he is showing up everywhere she goes. Erica's being stalked, and she can't seem to make it stop. She looks online for resources and learns about all the different ways that tech-facilitated stalking happens. She puts all her social media accounts to private. She stops device syncing in case Rob secretly set up one of his devices to sync with hers. She makes sure that he's not logged into her iCloud or her email accounts or all sorts of different things. But it's only when she opens up about the stalking to her friend group that she's able to finally figure out how Dan has been doing it. One of her friends who's very into cars points out that she got a new car while she was still dating Dan and asks if she checked her car's app to make sure that Dan isn't in there as a user. She looks at the app and after a little bit of digging sees, sure enough, he has an account in there and he has been able to see the location of her car this entire time. When she removes him from the car account, the stalking finally stops. With any product that has any type of location data, we need to remember that it can very easily be used for stalking and invasion of privacy. And this is a huge concern for millions of people. According to the crime survey for England and Wales from the Office for National Statistics, 1 in 10 women in the UK is stalked at some point during her lifetime. And there's also have been studies both in the UK and in America that have shown that stalking behavior is a very big risk factor for domestic homicide, where stalking behaviors are a precursor to the stalker murdering their victim. So this is something that we need to be taking really seriously. We need to think about if the product is making location data public to certain users, is it making that information available only to people that the user has actually chosen and consented to share that information with? Is there any other sneaky way that someone could see the location data? And we have to be really, really careful about how we think about this and think about it really hard, because this shows up in all sorts of different places. Some people might be familiar with Strava, the very popular fitness app. A few years ago, they came under fire because they had a new feature that would tag other Strava users who cross paths with you during a workout. This was really dangerous because the way they had it set up, made it so that even someone who had set all of their location settings to private would still make an appearance in someone else's workout. That person would then be able to view a whole map of their run or bike ride or whatever it was, which provides a lot of location data, including possibly where they lived. Next, is it completely clear to users when and how their location data is visible to others? In that Strava example, people had no idea that their location data was being revealed in this way. It wasn't something the user was educated about or had a chance to opt out of. And with Erica, she never got any type of email or alert that another user had been added to her car account. It wasn't until she went into the settings that she realized that someone was able to view the location of her car. And just like how surveillance involves a lot more than cameras or stalkerware, there are just so many devious ways that people can use tech to stalk each other and then just invade each other's privacy. And especially when they have access to the victim's device, which is something I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. This is another sort of recent example from last year that is very interesting and unusual. And it's using Google Play to track someone's movements. So this had to do with the writer of this article signed into their Google Play account on their wife's phone, but even after signing out, was still able to see the wife's data. We have to be really, really vigilant about location data because there are just so many unexpected ways like this that it can be revealed. Literally anytime there's any type of location data in a product, we need to be testing it from a stalking and domestic violence and invasion of privacy standpoint. This next story is going to go a little bit deeper into this topic, but the last point of this is privacy the default? With Strava, there are different features that have to do with location were all set to public by default. And that was really, really dangerous. To Strava's credit, I want to say they did change everything to be private by default and fix the issue of showing users showing up in each other's workouts, but only after they drew a bunch of heat on Twitter. I think products need to be getting authentic consent for any type of feature, especially ones that have to do with sensitive things like location data. Assuming that a user will know that a feature exists and then go into the settings to change it to whatever it is they actually want isn't the same as getting consent up front, which is what I'm going to explore a little bit in this next story, which is focused on issues of consent. Unlike all the rest of the stories that I've shared that are sort of composites of real people, this one is about a woman named Cecilia Vian, who's an acquaintance, and this is shared with her permission. She actually did a really great conference talk about her experience called Next Level Stalkerware. Cecilia is a designer in Norway. One time in the before times, before the pandemic, when she was still working completely in a physical office, she went to the grocery store and bought some tea that she then brought back to her office to keep there. This is tea that she's going to drink while she's at work. Later that night, she got home and her husband was rummaging around the kitchen and he asked her, "Hey, where is that fancy tea that you bought earlier?" It turns out that her husband, Tom, had downloaded an app for a large Norwegian grocery store chain and started using it. And because the two have a shared bank account, it added her shopping data to the app, allowing him to view her purchases that she had made with her debit card associated with their shared account. This was an issue of assumed consent. The grocery store app was designed to show her grocery store purchases because she had consented to the shared bank account. But she had never actually consented in any way to be part of the grocery store app. And while this was ultimately safe for Cecilia, the impacts of something like this in a domestic violence context are very clear because there are a lot of really sensitive things sold in grocery stores. An abuser would be able to see purchases such as pregnancy tests. In the US, they could see things like the purchase of Plan B, which is the morning after contraceptive. Parents might be able to see a child purchasing magazines with content that they disapprove of, such as LGBTQ+ content. We even get to issues of invasion of privacy, such as is grandma buying too much candy? Which might not seem like that big of a deal, but is still something that people just deserve privacy around what they're buying. The app also included the time of the purchase and the location of the grocery store, which goes back to issues of location data and privacy that we've already discussed. In an abusive context where someone has left their abuser, this information would give the abuser the ability to map out the victim's shopping habits, potentially do something like follow the victim home from their new grocery store, or to show up at a time when they know the victim won't be there. So when we're making considerations for consensual tech, we need to remember that a lack of consent can both endanger as well as just re-traumatize our users. I think that we as technologists should be looking to the anti-sexual assault and healthy sex practices space to inform how we handle consent with our tech. Thinking about things like, does the product get authentic consent? That doesn't mean putting location data on by default in the settings and making users go and change it. It doesn't mean opting someone into a product like it did with Cecilia just because she had opted into a different product. It also means things as that might seem as trivial as not pre-checking checkboxes to sign users up for promotional emails. That's not actually consensual. Next, is the product getting consent regularly? With healthy sex practices, we know that getting consent for a sex act in the past doesn't mean that there is consent for that same act forever in perpetuity in the future. You have to get consent every time. It should be the same with tech. For example, if we share our location with someone on Google Maps, I think that Google Maps could do more to get our consent regularly at different intervals until there's some confidence built up that we actually do want to be sharing our location forever with this person, which I'm actually going to talk more about in the next and final section. And then does the product understand that consent to one product or feature doesn't equal consent to another? Again, with healthy sex practices, we know consenting to one sex act doesn't mean you've consented to a different one. With Cecilia, the grocery store app kind of assumed that because she had consented to the shared bank account with her partner, that she would also consent to the grocery store app. But this should never happen. Consent has to be gotten for every new product and even lots of core features. All right, so we've covered the various key considerations for designing for safety, dug a little bit deeper into the issues of consent. And the next topic we're going to cover before getting into some final content about integrating this into your work is the domestic violence threat model. So, very quick story to explain how this works. Abby is a marketing expert who is pretty tech savvy. Her husband, Jim, is abusive and he's very controlling. He has demanded her phone's PIN code as well as certain account passwords. She really hates that he has access to these things, and she tries not to let her phone out of her sight. She knows not to do things like Google certain terms because he is looking at her browser history. She knows not to communicate with certain friends that he disapproves of using the products that he has access to. But one day when Abby is in the shower, Jim goes into her phone and opens up Google Maps. He shares the location with his own phone, then closes the app, puts it back where it was. This is an example of the domestic violence threat model. It essentially means that passwords don't always guarantee privacy, and that owning a device doesn't mean that others can't access it. For people like Abby, someone is simply able to go into her phone and do things that might harm her because of the context of domestic violence that she lives in. This is something that is often ignored when we think about security, since security professionals at this moment in time are paid mostly to consider anonymous threats like malicious hackers or things like phishing emails. I think that with this threat model, there's a lot of room for people outside of the security space to be thinking about this with the products that we are creating or regulating. So we need to make sure that we're considering that someone might not actually have been the one to take an action on their device, and plan for that with things like reminders sent to the user that sensitive information has been taken. This might mean sending more than one alert. And again, this is an example where we can't really prevent this, but we can do so much to mitigate it. So for example, there's often that initial email that gets sent informing someone there's a new person in their account. The abuser can just go in and delete it. So maybe we think about sending a second email a few hours later, hopefully when the victim is going to have their phone back and it won't get deleted. Or thinking about, is there a way to make this a notification within an app? Could there be some type of persistent state in the UI that's actually impossible to get rid of that makes it clear that this sensitive thing is happening? Right now, what Google does to kind of get at this is it sends a summary of who all you're sharing your location with every 30 days. But this is a new thing. People who've shared their location with someone permanently in the past don't get this email. I've tested this out. I had someone who I had shared my location with like 6 years ago, and I've never gotten one of these emails, but people who do it now will get them. So many people have stories, and it's often very amusing of like they've texted their friend, they're like, hey, I'm on my way to dinner, or whatever it is. And then the friend says like, no, you're not. And this is because they had shared their location with their friend years ago and totally forgot about it. It's just a very real thing that people do, especially in situations where they don't feel in that moment that there's any reason to be concerned, that there is no stalking potential or invasion of privacy or harm issue that they're worried about. And I bring this up because we need to remember that within a domestic violence context, the relationships usually start off really good and really healthy. Abusers usually aren't going to show their true colors like on the first date. They increase power and control over time. So while it may have been safe to share your location with someone in the past, it might not be now. And Google not including these older instances of location sharing in the 30-day email is a big issue. So for people sharing their location now, they get that email every 30 days, which is an okay solution. It's something, but I don't think it's quite there because a lot of damage can happen in 30 days. I think a safer solution would be to have a notification at different times of the day to try to get the information to the user at a point when they themselves have their phone. Maybe they get an email or a notification every day for 5 days at different times. And then if they continue to share their location after those things, then move into the 30-day summary. Okay, so the final little section here is I'm going to talk briefly about integrating this into your work. This is a whole chapter in my book. So this is a very, very basic overview. I have a whole separate talk about how this works, as well as a workshop where we actually practice doing it. And then I also just want to acknowledge that this is going to be pretty design focused, but I've tried to keep it broad enough that hopefully everyone here today is going to be able to get something out of it. So this is the process for inclusive safety. It's a summary of the different things that I've done over the past few years to get at designing for safety and include steps that can happen at each point throughout the design process. This graphic could basically be like printed out on a transparency and put on top of the double diamond design process that a lot of folks are familiar with. It essentially includes activities and things to do at each point that will help you identify different types of abuse and give you the chance to work against them in a meaningful way. None of these is actually very difficult or time consuming. It's really just about making the time to do them. So I've included time summaries in this graphic to try to provide an estimate for your stakeholder if you actually end up doing this, because getting people to say yes to doing this is a whole thing. A lot of people aren't going to prioritize it. This is a whole separate topic of like, how do you convince people that this matters, that you should do it? But one thing that I have found is that it's a lot easier for stakeholders to say yes to something when you present them with an actual time frame. So saying, I want 24 hours to spend on this over the next 8 weeks. And sort of like what the breakdown is going to be per week. That's going to be a lot easier to say yes to than just like, I want to do this thing. It's really important. And I don't know how much time it's going to take. So hopefully this is helpful with that. So first, there is research into existing news or academic literature about how similar products or features have been weaponized for harm. So looking for articles, looking at Google Scholar to find anything you can about safety issues or issues of privacy in similar products or features to whatever it is that you are designing. Then there's the creation of archetypes. For people who are familiar with personas, it's sort of like a stripped down persona. You include an abuser and their goals, such as, I want to use this product to stalk my ex. And the survivor or victim and their goals, such as, I want to make sure my ex can't ever find me. These archetypes can be informed by the research, because you'll often have come across some specific stories that will sort of inspire the archetypes. You might also have to have multiple pairs of archetypes to capture different types of safety issues that you've identified in your research. Then there's brainstorming novel abuse cases. So this is coming up with new forms of harm that aren't included in the research that you did. These are brand new harms that the product will enable. Then there is solutioning for ways to either prevent the identified harm or more likely mitigating the harm. This is a huge step that this graphic makes look really simple, because what usually happens is that people have a whole list of things that they want to tackle, of different types of harms or just issues that they need to explore further. And they might actually kind of break that out and go through the entire process again for each of them, because some of them will be really, really big topics. But this is basically the step where you find solutions for the different types of harm that you have identified, and then you test it, similar to usability testing towards the end of the design process. So you use the archetypes for this testing. So for example, the archetype of the X, who wants to be able to find any information about their former partner who their goal is to stalk. You might test it and see if there's any way to get any type of location information about another user, even if they have their settings set to private. This is something that if Strava had done, they could have designed their product to be safe up front, rather than only doing it after getting called out on Twitter. These things don't all have to be done, all these steps. You can do what makes sense for you, kind of modify it as you need. One final thing I want to talk about is why this is called the process for inclusive safety and not just the process for safety. It's because going through this process always reveals other types of harm that don't have to do strictly with interpersonal safety, and that's a good thing. That is great. That's the goal. I found that working through this with different groups, a lot of times, almost every time actually, people will start to identify things that don't have to do with like an abuser or bad actor trying to weaponize the product. But they find something that the software is just going to like unintentionally enable, something that will be more of an unintentional harm. But going through this process will often open up people's minds and just provide space to identify all sorts of different harms and not just the interpersonal ones. And that is a good thing. Thank you so much for your time today. That is everything I have. And now we will move into the Q&A. Again, this is my book. You can get it at abookapart.com. Feel free to contact me, Eva at aflight, and I am on Twitter, at least for now.
Fantastic. So I'm sure you'll all thank me, or join me rather, in thanking Eva for that. I think that's a powerful insight into the human stories that urge us to put privacy first. Now, unfortunately, it turns out Eva isn't joining us for questions live, but she does tell me she's very happy to answer questions posed to her either directly on Twitter, as you saw, she's at Eva PenzeyMoog, or at the email address that she just shared on the final slide there, which is eva@eighthlight.com. And that brings our event to a close today. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as we have. We would love to hear your feedback on the event. So we're posting a link in the chat shortly, and you'll also receive that same link to our feedback form via email. It should take you only a minute or two to fill in, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Many thanks from all of us here at the ICO to you for attending and for showing a commitment to prioritizing privacy in your work. And of course, many thanks to our speakers and panelists today as well. I'd like to close, if I may, with a reminder to please check out our new guidance for designers, product managers, software engineers, all about privacy in the product design lifecycle. And that's live now at ico.org.uk/privacy-design. So that's all from me. Goodbye for now, and wishing you the very best of luck in your privacy journeys.